Have you ever heard someone compare the Gospels to the telephone game? You know, the game where the first person whispers something like, "The dog ate my homework," to the person next to them, and then that person whispers to the next, and so on. And by the time it gets to the last person, the message is announced and it's totally wrong, like, "The cat crashed my car." The question we're asking today is simple. Are the Gospels actually like that game of telephone? If they are, then that's a major problem for Christians, but if they aren't, then critics really should drop this false analogy. Let's look at 5 reasons why the comparison fails and why critics should never use this analogy again, unless it's to show how dissimilar they are. Number 1, the telephone game is one person to one person. The entire group does not hear the same message at the same time, and so all it takes is one person in the chain to destroy the original message. Compare this to the ministry of Jesus, which was performed in public. Beyond the thousands of people who publicly heard the words of Jesus, he also had a following of his 12 disciples, plus many other close followers. The teachings of the early church were not one-to-one like the telephone game. They were also done in group settings. This point alone is sufficient to show the comparison is a false comparison. Number 2, the telephone game and the Gospels had very different goals. The telephone game's goal is to mess up, so it's funny. The words of Jesus, on the other hand, were life and death to early Christians. The goals being so different is another fatal flaw in this false comparison. Number 3, oral cultures had far more capable memories than we do. People from oral cultures could memorize vast amounts of information. Even memorizing the Torah was not entirely uncommon. For the disciples specifically, as students of Jesus, they very likely would have been memorizing his sayings and teachings for 3 years of his public ministry. This memory ability combined with the repetition over years is significantly different than listening to a quick whisper one time. Number 4, no controls versus controls. In the game of telephone, there's no authority figure or group ensuring the accuracy of the messages being transmitted. Compare this to oral cultures, which are not one and the same. So depending on the culture, they had different methods of retelling and preserving stories. The first is called formal controlled tradition, where stories could only be told by individuals in authority positions. The second is informal, uncontrolled tradition, where any person could retell a story and there was no authority checking for accuracy. These two traditions are basically opposites, and neither of these categories fit with how information was retold in the early church. The first century church was what we call an informal, controlled tradition. Dr. William D. Muntz, the scholar and Bible translator, writes, quote, "Informal controlled tradition means that anyone can retell the stories, but people in authority are able to say whether or not the retelling is accurate." This oral culture and tradition is the complete opposite of the telephone game. Muntz also writes, quote, "Informal controlled tradition best explains how gospel stories can be consistent in their core elements and yet vary in the incidentals. For this reason, many scholars accept informal controlled tradition as an accurate picture of how the church retold stories of Jesus." And this ties into our last point. The eyewitnesses and disciples safeguarded their testimony. Critics often act as if the disciples and eyewitnesses disappeared from the face of the earth, and somehow then the traditions were passed on by anonymous individuals with no real tie to the events. This could not be further from the truth. The scholar Vincent Taylor writes of the eyewitnesses in the gospel accounts that they did not go into a permanent retreat. For at least a generation, they moved among the young Palestinian communities, and through preaching and fellowship, their recollections were at the disposal of those who sought information. The German historian and scholar Martin Hengel wrote that the personal link of the Jesus tradition with particular tradents, or more precisely their memory and missionary preaching, is historically undeniable. Overall, these 5 reasons are more than enough to bury the false comparison of the Gospels to the game of telephone.